Thanks, guys, for that first carrier update. Right now, we're going to welcome for our top story of the day, editor-at-large and oil and gas expert, especially after this week, John Kingston. John, thank you for joining us. You've had quite the busy week. One, watching the oil markets, the crazy up and down ride, and two, you were at the CERA conference in Houston this week as well.
Yes, I was. I've been going to the CERA Week conference since the 90s sometime, and they actually amazingly had record attendance this year. When I first started going, the attendance would be measured in the hundreds. Now they had almost 6,000 people, and that's really without the normal huge Asian contingent showing up because they've got quarantine issues. So, people wanted to get out and they wanted to talk energy, and they certainly did for a week. I think you'd be surprised at how little discussion there was about the current situation. CERA Week tends to be very kind of forward-looking. What's the energy future? And now it's obviously an extremely disruptive time in some ways. By some measurements, we've never had a period like this. But that wasn't really the whole focus of the discussion. They had other plans. But I'm sure let's get to the price of oil right now. I want to give some numbers to start. These are the changes on the ultra-low sulfur diesel contract on the CME commodity exchange over the last 5 trading days. Now, let's note that market may on an average day move 1 to 2 cents per gallon, sometimes even less. If it moves more than 2 cents a gallon in a day, that's quite a bit. Last 5 days, up 34.36 cents, followed by a day of little change, up 27.29 cents, up 14.52 cents, up 51.58 cents, which is a record one-day upward move, followed by a day that was down 97.3 cents a gallon. That's a record move downward. And then followed yesterday by a downward move of 16.81 cents. And when I got up this morning, it was up about 8 cents per gallon. And a half hour ago, it was up about 2 cents a gallon. That is a volatile market.
Yeah, that is a volatile market indeed. I'm doing a mental charting in my head of the ups and downs, and I'm getting a little bit nauseous here. When you're looking at this market and the sudden rises, one of the things that we always see in typical trends is like the faster it goes up, the faster it can come down. But it really seems like the moderating trend has been generally upward with all these upward and downward movements.
Well, certainly. I mean, look, the bottom line is this. In some of the discussions at CERA Week about the loss of Russian oil, the number that I keep hearing was about 3 to 4 million barrels a day. Remember, Russia produces about 10 million barrels a day. They consume, at least, this is before their presumably economic implosion. They consumed about 3 to 3.5 million barrels a day themselves. What I'm hearing is they're going to lose about 3 to 4 million barrels a day of exports. That what's in between, the assumption is that there is no worldwide embargo. So the assumption is that some of this stuff will get out one way or the other. It'll get out very cheaply. The Russians are going to have to cut their prices to move it. But we're not going to embargo every last barrel of oil, whether it's a legal embargo like President Biden imposed earlier this week on U.S. imports, or whether it's what is now being called self-sanctioning, where companies don't want to be seen as buying, as doing commerce with Russia. 4 million barrels a day. What's really nice about the current market is that it is about 100 million barrel a day market. So percentage-wise, it's really easy to do. So that's about 4% of world supply. That is a massive disruption it's really a massive disruption anywhere. The disruption on the demand side when the pandemic hit was probably about 15 to 20%. Because the market then was about 100 million barrels a day. So in terms of a supply disruption, this is not as big as the demand disruption was when the pandemic hit, but still to lose 4 million barrels a day all at once is very, very big.
So, John, yesterday we spoke with Scott Bering, who is our director of FreightWaves Academy here, and got kind of his 2 cents about what's going on with the oil markets and resulting fuel prices. He made a really interesting point that we're not necessarily seeing a product shortage yet. Like, we're not running out of oil, we're not running out of fuel, at least here domestically in the United States, and that some of this price change and the up and down in the markets is really kind of this psychological effect of people being afraid of what could happen. Do you see that kind of being the same case?
Well, we certainly, well, look, right now you've got very tight supplies. All the inventory numbers show a tight market. So you don't run out. What happens is the tightness just gets reflected in the price. And the big question out here, and this is one that came up a lot in the discussions in Houston, is what is the price that starts to invoke demand destruction, where people start using less oil as a result of the high price? The all-time high price for crude was about $145 a barrel. That was back in July 2008. Adjusted for inflation, that's like around $195 now. So, we're not even close to the all-time high. We certainly had demand destruction in the final months of that climb up to July 2008. I keep hearing some estimates by economists that they do not think we are at the point yet where there is demand destruction. I really wonder if this has not been a gradual increase. This has been a shocking increase. And I think maybe when you get it that fast, it does cause a psychological move to some demand destruction, maybe quicker than if it's a nice steady curve up. So no, there in that sense, there is no shortage. There are tight markets, and you're seeing that reflected in the in the price. Where I think I might disagree with Scott, who I've known for many years. It's not really such a psychological. I mean, there is a significant loss of supply in this market. I mean, it's psychological would be. I mean, I'll give you a classic case of psychological. On the 9/11, when the planes hit the towers, you suddenly had gas lines all over this country because I think people sat there and said, well, terrorism, death, Middle East, oil. Let me go fill up my tank. And the fact is, anybody who knew oil knew that that wasn't going to create a shortage of oil, and in fact was probably going to lower economic activity, which it did, which might create a surplus of oil. That was a psychological, that was fear. This is real. We're going to be down several million barrels a day of oil supply from Russia.
John, one of the articles that you wrote coming out of CERA Week conference had to do with Amos Hochstein and his comments about the Biden administration's role in what's going on with the oil markets and some of the common misconceptions that are going on, I think, both from a public standpoint and from just a general business standpoint of this, because the government's involvement in this isn't necessarily as deep as some might think, right? There's a lot of supply chain issues that are hampering domestic oil production. There's labor issues that are hampering domestic oil production as well. Can you talk us through a little bit of that conversation from the Secretary, or from the State Department, that is, and kind of what he gave you as far as this information?
Yeah, so Amos Hochstein is a longtime Washington oil expert on foreign relations. I actually met with him many years ago. He actually was followed by Jennifer Granholm a day later. She's the Secretary of Energy. And they both said there is nothing that the federal government is doing to restrict supply. Now, what people in the oil industry will tell you are kind of like, they'll have kind of the same complaints that they would have had before the war. Permitting takes too long, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Jennifer Granholm did make reference to speeding up the permitting process. But I think the more relevant meeting, and I didn't write a story about it yet, but I did send a tweet out after Jennifer Granholm spoke, and she kind of echoed what Amos Hochstein said. I went to a panel, and it was a panel of 3 leading executives in the oil exploration and production division, including a guy named Scott Sheffield, who was widely quoted. He's very comfortable talking to the press. And they all said, we're not going to go do what we did before. If you go back and you look at the U.S. production in, let's say, 2018, 2019, you look at the rig count, both of them are higher than it is today. So you can say, well, why can't we get back to that? Well, the reason we were at those levels before was because this industry was kind of out of control. The whole idea was produce, produce, produce. They borrow lots of money, they drill lots of wells, they produce lots of hydrocarbons, they make a profit. All their profits would be eaten up to pay the debt that they took on in the first place. They'd have no free cash flow, and they'd have no dividends. That was not going to be sustainable forever. And this is the point that Scott and the other 2 gentlemen, one who was with ConocoPhillips and the third was from, I don't remember right now, made the point that, like, we're not just going to go crazy now, even though we are getting called upon kind of to do our patriotic duty, but also cut to some of the point that Amos Hochstein said, I think it was Hochstein who said, when we talk to oil industry people, we ask, what can we do for you? And they say, well, can you get us more frac sand? Can you get us more workers? The federal government has nothing to do with that. So yeah, they've got supply chain problems too. So there's always been this perception going back a long time. Even before I covered oil, I consumed it. And I got my driver's license during the first oil crisis in 1974. So I kind of had baptism by fire. There's always been this feeling that even though the oil industry in the U.S. is privately held, it's a private sector, there's no state oil company, that the federal government can push a few buttons here and there and give us more oil. And that if we don't have enough oil, it's because they're not pushing on the right buttons. I'm sorry, but that's just not the case.
And John, in closing here, maybe this might be a little bit of a shot in the dark, but taking it back to the first part of this interview, looking at some of that Russian oil eventually getting out to the rest of the world, do you see any potential neutral-ish countries or parties that might be used as a funnel to get some of that oil out?
It's a good question because there was some news overnight. The crude that comes out of Sakhalin Island, this big Sakhalin Island project that Exxon announced that they're going to withdraw from, is very popular. Sakhalin is in the far east of Russia, and it's really a peninsula I guess it's an island, off the eastern coast of Russia. And they have production there, and it's a very popular crude to be refined in Korea and Asia because, it's a very small route. You don't have to ship it many, many miles to get it there. They had a tender, and the tender had no bids. So, I'm saying it's going to leak out just because I've seen this before in the past. But quite frankly, right now, the routes out of it don't looking too easy. They may be able to sell it to some refineries in, sub-Saharan Africa. But what kind of a price are they going to get? What kind of economics are they going to get? They can't load up these giant tankers and send it to big refining centers in sub-Saharan Africa. They don't exist. So even though I'm saying that early on, Anthony, you picked up on that, I'm still not all that sure what those routes are. A very interesting point. When the U.S., of course, the U.S. is banned it now, but even before that, every month, the Energy Department, in conjunction with the Commerce Department, comes out with a very detailed spreadsheet on all the imported oil into the U.S. and who imports it. And one of the points that was being made at a breakfast I was at is that when that number comes out for, let's say, March, which will come out, I guess, like in May or June, and these importers are identified by name, nobody wants to be on that list. Mm-hmm. Nobody. Just like Shell bought that oil last week, and boy, they were sorry they did.
Absolutely, John. Thank you so much for keeping your thumb on this. We'll talk to you again next Friday. Have a great weekend, and we'll catch up with you then.
You too.